How to deploy a managed Kubernetes on Amazon's AWS, that's EKS, Elastic Kubernetes Service, using step-by-step procedure, where Kubernetes is a managed container solution that consists of a master node and multiple worker nodes, where master node is managed by AWS and you as a customer will manage all the worker nodes. And the typical workflow of creating a Elastic Kubernetes service involves first provisioning a EKS cluster, then creating one or more worker nodes, then connecting to this Elastic Kubernetes service using tool of your choice like kubectl, then finally deploying applications on pod. How to deploy all this using a step-by-step procedure from AWS console. I'm going to show you all this in today's episode. Welcome to another episode of weekly video series on Docker and Kubernetes with me, Atul Kumar from team K2N Academy, where we take you from complete beginner on Docker, Kubernetes and cloud native applications and help you in your certification and make you expert on Docker and Kubernetes. But before I show you the step-by-step procedure to create a Elastic Kubernetes service on AWS console, so let me give you the context behind today's episode. So I have a comprehensive step-by-step training program on Docker and Kubernetes for beginners, including Certified Kubernetes Administrator, which is certification from Cloud Native Computing Foundation, CNCF. And in this program, we have an extensive 33 hands-on lab with 1 year on-job support. So a lot of our existing students wanted to know how to deploy this Kubernetes on AWS. So we decided to have a dedicated mini program covering everything related to Kubernetes on Amazon's AWS, which is EKS, Elastic Kubernetes Service, and two other components like Fargate and ECH, which is Elastic Container Service. So I decided to create this program and gave it to my old existing students on Kubernetes. Those are part of Certified Kubernetes Administration certification. And I'm also planning to give this bonus free for my new student who are joining in this next batch, which is starting on 12th of September. Now, if you have never attended my free training on Docker and Kubernetes for beginners, including certification, so I'm going to tell a little bit more about this towards end and how you can get hold of this bonus Kubernetes on AWS towards end of this episode. First, let's quickly have a look at container orchestration, Docker and Kubernetes options on AWS, and the installation options and which one we are going to look at in today's episode. So Kubernetes is a container orchestration and management tools. So what you see, these three nodes, like that you can have multiple nodes or hosts on which you're running containers, multiple containers, and these multiple containers are where your microservices or applications are running. So similar to Kubernetes, you also have other orchestration tools like Mesos or Docker Swarm. But in last 3-4 years, Kubernetes has come out as a leader in container orchestration tool, capturing 70+% market on container orchestration. So on AWS, you get three solutions. First is Elastic Container Service, which is ECS. Second is EKS, which is Elastic Kubernetes Service. And third is Fargate, AWS Fargate Service, where ECS is a container orchestration tool that is created by AWS. Then you have an Elastic Kubernetes Service, which is a managed Kubernetes, which is same open source Kubernetes, but presented as a platform by AWS. And third is Fargate, which is container on demand. So when you're deploying ECS or EKS, you need to create a cluster. Whereas Fargate, you don't need to create a cluster. You just say, I want containers or container on demand. Now, detailed description about or differences between these three, I'm going to discuss in one of the future episodes. And when you're looking at the deployment options or installation options of Kubernetes, you can create a Kubernetes for development purpose where you're doing it just for testing. So you can deploy using Minikube, or you have Kubernetes using Docker Desktop. So Docker Desktop has a version of Kubernetes. Or you can do unmanaged using kubeadm, kops, which is on AWS, or kubespray. All these three options are for unmanaged Kubernetes using installer based. Now you have something called managed Kubernetes, which is an open source Kubernetes deployed as a managed service by the cloud vendors like Azure from Microsoft, which is AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service, or Google Kubernetes Engine, or Oracle Container Engine for Kubernetes. Something similar from AWS's EKS Elastic Kubernetes Service. So this is the one which we're going to look at today. So that managed Kubernetes on AWS, that's EKS, Elastic Kubernetes Service can be deployed in one of the two methods. You can either use a command line utility called EKS CTL, which is Elastic Kubernetes Service CTL control basically, or you can do it using console. So I'm going to show you today from console. And if I see the demand, I might show it via the EKS CTL command line as well. So in order for you to understand the deployment using console, you need to understand one final concept, which is the architecture of Kubernetes. Now, Kubernetes consists of a master node and one or more multiple worker nodes. These three nodes are worker nodes, and this is where your application runs on these worker nodes. So you have the master node, which consists of various components like Kube API, etcd, Kube scheduler, or Kube controller manager. And then you have these multiple worker nodes where you have the container runtime on which your application is running. And you also have a cloud controller. And the role of this cloud control manager is to provide the underlying cloud resources like storage, compute, load balancers, networking, and so on. And if you want to know more about this architecture, have a look at one of the previous episodes at ketonacademy.com/Kubernetes 12, where we go in detail about these components. Now, when you're deploying, you'll be deploying first the master node, and then you're deploying the worker node. And master node will have its one VPC, which is a network or virtual private cloud, and another network for your worker nodes where all your applications will be deployed. These three boxes here represents three worker nodes. So when we say manage Kubernetes, you will first deploy the master node, then you deploy the worker node, and then you connect to this EKS using your utility like kubectl, and then we are going to run applications on this Kubernetes worker nodes. So first, let's have a look at what are the high-level steps you need to do in order to install and configure Kubernetes or manage Kubernetes on AWS, which is Elastic Kubernetes Service or EKS. So the first thing you'll be doing is the setting up the master node. And once master node is set up, then you do install AWS CLI and kubectl. So AWS CLI is required to check the status of this Kubernetes cluster. And later when we install worker node, or in future when we install the application on this Kubernetes cluster, we can remotely control and check the status of Kubernetes or EKS. That will use AWS CLI as well as kubectl remotely. So once we have installed and configured the CLI and kubectl, then we'll validate that the cluster we created is working successfully. And then we'll install and configure these worker nodes. Now, worker node is where you'll be running your pods on which your applications will be deployed. And finally, once we have done all this setup, if you don't want to use this cluster anymore, then you can destroy or delete it so that you don't get charged for Kubernetes cluster if you're doing this for testing purpose. So within the master node, you'll be first logging into the AWS portal, and then go to the console on EKS, which I'm going to show you in a minute, and click on Kubernetes cluster or create Kubernetes cluster. Now, in order for you to create a cluster, this Kubernetes cluster should have access to some roles so that the underlying storage, nodes, scalability or auto scaling features or load balancer configuration, all those can be controlled or access can be granted for these services to your EKS cluster. And once those configurations are done, you'll be able to create the EKS cluster or master node. Once the master node is done, we need to test that whether the master node is working correctly or not. And for that, I'm going to use my laptop to see or install a AWS command line interface or AWS CLI tool, and with kubectl, which is acting as a client to my Kubernetes cluster or EKS cluster. So I'm going to bring all my Kubernetes configuration from EKS that I've configured in the previous step, and then configure the kubectl to be able to connect to the EKS or Elastic Kubernetes service. And then I'll validate the configuration whether I can access my master node from kubectl running on my laptop. Then once my master node is up and running and I've tested and verified, then I'm going to install worker nodes, which is nothing but behind the scene, there'll be Elastic Compute EC2 instances on which the Kubernetes worker node will be deployed. And finally, I'll verify that worker nodes are all accessible from the command line or kubectl that I've installed earlier. And once this is all tested, then I'll destroy this Kubernetes cluster so that I don't get charged because I'm not running any application. I'm using this environment just for testing purpose to show it to you here. So let's first go directly to AWS console and create the Kubernetes cluster. So I'm in my AWS management console. And if you don't have a trial account and you want to configure EKS with me here, then you can create a trial account by going to this URL, ketonacademy.com/AWS SA13. In past, I've created a video about how to create a free trial account. So watch this video on this blog post, and also my colleague have posted the steps on how to create a trial account on AWS. So make sure once after creating the account, you log in, and here under find services, search for EKS. So this is Elastic Kubernetes Service. Click on this. Now, if you see here very quickly, you have three options here. ECS is Elastic Container Service. These are containers. This is the EKS that we are interested on. And then ECR is another service, which is a repository. This is where your container images are stored. So this is ECR. We are interested in EKS. So we'll select here EKS and then enter the Kubernetes cluster name that you want to create. So I'll create it with the name Keton Academy, K8S01. So just a random name I've taken, Keton Academy, Kubernetes 01, and click on next step. So this is where the version of Kubernetes. I'm recording it on September 2020, and currently, as of today, the latest version of Kubernetes is 1.19, but on AWS, I only have option to 14, 15, 16, and 17. So I'll go with latest version 1.17. Now on the next screen, this is where I need to select a role. Now I don't have any role because I've not created any role. This role is so that my Kubernetes cluster can go and provision my worker nodes or can have access to the underlying storage or networking or load balancer. What all things that are required in order for Kubernetes cluster to run successfully, I should be able to access those services via this role. So I don't have any roles accessible. So I'll click on IAM console and I'll go to the roles page. And this is where I'll go and create a role. Now this is where available roles. I'll select AWS roles, and from our common use cases EC2, I'll here click on EKS, and under use cases under EKS, I want to set up the cluster. So the Fargate is another container service available on, or container or Kubernetes service available on AWS. So I'm interested on EKS cluster. So I'll select EKS cluster and click on next permission. And here there's a permission called Amazon EKS cluster policy. So I'll leave it selected that I've selected this policy. Click on next tags, leave the default. We are not defining any tags, and click on next review. So this is where I'm assigning or creating a role with one policy called Amazon EKS cluster policy, and it'll give a role name. So I can say EKS cluster role or any role name of your choice, and click on create role. So I can see my role created here. I'll go back to the tab earlier, which I was working on to create a cluster. Just click on refresh here. And then from drop down, you should be able to select or see this cluster role here. Now, encryptions are like when on the storage, the data is always encrypted, but it will be encrypted using AWS keys. If I want to encrypt it using on my own keys, I can create these keys and select here. So I'm leaving it default. I'll let AWS encrypt the data. And here I don't want to apply any tags. So I can leave tags blank and click next. Now this is where my Kubernetes master node will need a network on which it will create these machines, or the master node or the server where master node is running. And that master node must be running inside a network. So this is what I'm selecting here, VPC. So this VPC is where my network, and I'm leaving the default network that comes with the trial account. So in the diagram that I mentioned earlier, this is the network in which I'm creating my control plane or the master node. So when I'm saying create a VPC or select a VPC, this is that private cloud that I'm selecting on which my master node is deployed. So the master node will be deployed automatically on, and it will be deployed in one of these subnets that comes default with my EKS setup. Now security group is firewall. I'll leave it default. Now this is where the cluster endpoint. So this is my API server. Again, going back to this diagram here. So I have an API server. So kubectl is going to make connection to this API server. So this API server is its endpoint is public, which means I can access it over the internet. Now I want to access it from my laptop, and hence I'll leave it public. But in your production environment, you might want to keep it internal or private. If you don't want to expose this endpoint to the public, then leave it private. But here I'm doing it for testing purpose, I'll leave public. Now, these work, if I select public and private, that means my worker nodes, they want to connect, they will come over the internet and then will be able to, will be accessing this via the public endpoint. Or if I say it's public and private, then those worker node will be accessing my API server privately on the internal IP. So for the time being, because it's a test environment, I'll leave it public and click on next. Now, all my logging for all these API server, audit, authenticator, these logging disabled for now. And in future episodes, we might enable them and see how you can integrate with CloudWatch or other logging tools. For the time being, leave it default disabled and click on next. And this is where I'm reviewing, and that's all I need to do to create my master node. Now remember, I've not set up my worker node yet. I've just setting up my master node. So verify my cluster version is 1.17. This is my cluster name. I'm assigned this cluster role to this, and I've not defined any tags. My network, the VPC will be this, and it'll have 3 subnets. So I'll create 3 nodes on these 3 subnets. My cluster endpoint or API server is public, and all my control plane logging is disabled right now. Click create, and it'll create in few minutes, it'll create the master node. Now, while it's installing or creating the master node, let's create or install CLI, which is AWS CLI, kubectl, and then we'll configure the AWS CLI so that I can run kubectl commands from remotely from my laptop. So the next, we're installing AWS CLI, and for that I have 2 links. I'm going to put those into the show notes, and those will be available at ketonacademy.com/Kubernetes25. So let's go to these 2 URLs. First one, we are installing the CLI, which is AWS CLI, and second, I'm configuring that CLI so that CLI can talk to my AWS account. So this is the first link, and depending on where you want to connect, if you're connecting from Mac machines, you click on this, select this. If on Linux or connecting from Linux, this is we are installing CLI or AWS CLI or a command line interface, so we can talk to cluster from the command line interface. I'm on Windows, so first thing is, if you don't have CLI installed, you need to download it. So this is, I've already downloaded. Just double click on that and it'll install the software for you. And once you have installed, just type AWS -- version. So the version should be higher than 2.0.42. So I'm starting the command prompt, and from here just simply say AWS -- version, and that will tell you what is the version of AWS. And in my case, it's 2044, and here I need it's 2042 or higher. So I've installed AWS CLI. That's all you need to do to install. Next is you need to configure your CLI. You need to set the access key ID and the secret access key. Now, where do you get these? I'll show you in a minute. So I'm go to my EKS account, and under there search for IAM, or under services, click on IAM service. And from here, under your root access keys, drop down here and say managed security credentials. And under here expand these access keys. Now already created an access key. Or you can have, I think, up to 2 access keys. So I'll create one new, or let me delete this. This is one which I created earlier. So I'll say delete, yes. And now I'm creating a new access key. So by clicking on this, you'll get an access key. Now you click on show access key. I'm not going to show it, or I'll hide that access key, but make sure you keep this key safe with you and copy these keys with you, because I'm going to use that in next screen. I've collected my access key ID and access key, both ID and key. So I'll go to the command prompt again, and this time I'll say AWS configure. Now I already once configured on this AWS CLI, so that's why it's saying there is a key. So I'll enter my new key. If you've changed that, or because I've deleted my old key and I'm using the new key, so I'll enter here the key ID, hit enter, and then I need to paste here access key. Don't try with this key, because I'm going to delete this key after this demo. So it will not work even if you try. So this is just to show you here. Now default region name, you can leave it blank, or because you can change it when you are passing or running AWS CLI, that time you can enter what region name you want to give. Hit enter, and then default output format also leave it blank and hit enter. Now, whatever steps I've done, I'll share these CLI configure on show notes, as I said earlier, under ketonacademy.com/Kubernetes 25, and you can pick it out those links from here if you can't find these links here. Now, once I've installed the CLI, next is I need to install kubectl. The kubectl is a command line utility to interact with my Kubernetes API server. And I'm going to use this kubectl later in the section to find out the status of master node as well as my worker nodes. So the steps again to install kubectl is also again, I'll paste them on the show notes on the blog, which is ketonacademy.com/Kubernetes 25. So depending on where you're installing, Mac, whether it's on Mac, Linux, or Windows, this kubectl will be installed on the same machine where you've installed just now the CLI, AWS CLI. So all you need to do is just copy here this command, depending on what version of Kubernetes you want to install. I've selected 1.17, that's why I'm using 1.17 version of kubectl. So go back here and curl and hit enter. So it will download my exe, and then you can go and double click and install this kubectl by double clicking on that, and that will install kubectl. So this has downloaded this kubectl under this folder. So I'm on this folder, just double click on this kubectl. I've already installed this kubectl. So all I need to do is see that kubectl should be here in this location. So I'm not installing anything, just type kubectl, and that I have this executable in my path or this location, so I can access this kubectl. Now next is I need to configure or set up my kubectl. Right now this kubectl doesn't know where exactly my API server or master node is. So I'm going to tell now that where my master node is. So in order to do that, first I need to set up my AWS CLI, and for that I need to find out two things. One is my region, and second is my EKS cluster name. And then I need to run this command like AWS space EKS and -- region, and whatever is the region name for this cluster, and then name of my Kubernetes cluster, and then -- query cluster status. So that way I'll be able to see whether from this command line I can access my cluster or not. So I'm back on my console. I'll click on Elastic Kubernetes Service EKS. And this is my Kubernetes cluster name, which is Keton Academy K8S01. So I'll make a note of it here. This is my replaced by name here. And I need to find out in which region my Kubernetes cluster is. So region, it'll be from here. If you see here, drop down. Here in this case, it's saying US East Ohio, US East 2. So I've already selected, I think, US East 2. So I've already selected US East 2. So I'll just simply copy this and run this command on the command prompt here. And it'll tell me whether my cluster is ready or not. So it says, yes, cluster is active, and I can see this status from here as well. The cluster is active. So same thing, I can see it from console and from here as well. Now I need to do one more thing. I need to fetch now all my configuration from my master node, which is we have just configured, I'll bring that configuration onto my Kubernetes kubectl running on my laptop, then run my kubectl commands, all my commands like status of the pods or nodes or all cluster through this kubectl. So for that, I need to say update kubeconfig. This command I need to run, and where name is my name of the Kubernetes cluster. So here same command, but instead of name, this is my name of the cluster. So I'm saying EKS region. This is my region is US East 2, and I'm saying update the kube config. So whatever is configuration on the kubectl currently, it'll be replaced by whatever is the latest or whatever is this cluster configurations are from here. So I hit enter and say update config. So what it has done is it has added a context on my kube config. So this is my .cube is the folder, hidden folder. Inside there is a config folder. So let me quickly go and look at that location. So this is my user, and inside that there is a folder called .cube, and this is the config file which it has created. So let me open it via the Word, and so this is how it's saying. This is my API version 1. My clusters, this is one of the clusters. This is my certificate. So this is connecting to my EKS using the clusters. This is my cluster name or location, and this is the cluster key which I've picked up. This is my certificate authority data. And so this is how it knows that where my Kubernetes cluster is running on EKS or AWS. So now I'm going to see the kubectl get service. So earlier I saw the status from AWS CLI. Now I'm going to run from Kubernetes command like kubectl. If I fire this command kubectl get service, so I have this service which is cluster IP service configured and running. That means it's been able to connect to the master node and get the service detail. So now we have installed WCLI. So just to do a quick recap, so far we have set up the master node. We have set up the command line interface, which is kubectl and AWS CLI. And the final step now is to create the worker node. Now, in order to configure the worker node, I'll come back to the cluster here on the console, and here you click on compute. And now once you see the status is active, you're going to add the node group, and node group is nothing but collection of nodes or groups on which acting as your worker nodes. So I'll say add a node group. And this is where I'm creating a node group which will have the worker nodes. So I'll say group one or whatever node group name you want. Now I need to specify now the worker node will also need an IAM role so that they have limited privileges. We don't want to give the worker node same privileges as we gave it to the master node, because master node is the one which controls or which creates underlying storage, adding nodes, load balancers, but the worker node doesn't need that information. Worker node only need a limited access, and those limited access are these three. First one is EKS CNI, which is a networking policy. Second is the worker node policy, EKS worker node policy, and third is the read access on the ECS container images. So this worker node should be able to read images from the registry so that they can fetch the images which are nothing but your applications or your container applications using which your containers are run. So these are the three permissions, all you need. So again, I'll click on IAM console role and click here and say create a role. So I'll come here and click on select AWS service, click on EC2 and click on permissions. And here you're going to first select and type here Amazon EKS. And this is first one we need to say CNI policy and then worker node policy. These are the predefined policies that are for the worker node. And apart from these, I'll need one more, which is Amazon EC2 container, and I need a read container registry read only. So I'll select these three and then click on next tags. Leave the tag field blank or default. Click on next review. So now make sure you have these three policies, one for networking, second is for worker node, and third is the access to read the registry, read the images from the container registry. So we can say EKS worker node policy and then click on create role. Once a role is created, you go back to the previous tab, refresh here, and you should be able to now see that tab or that role. So select that role here, and these templates are my EC2 or the worker node templates. I'm not going to select template. Label is again Kubernetes concept. We are not going to apply or select labels here. We'll create these labels later when we look at or configure services or pods in future on this. Then click on next. Now this is where I'm defining the shape of these machines or the worker node. So first is what kind of an image we are doing Linux to, and instance type is or shape. Now remember here that your charge or the costing will be based on the shape you select. In order to save cost, I'm going to select a micro. So you will say I'll select here T3 micro and I'll select only 5 GB disk. It just we want to see how these node look like or how this cluster look like. In production, you probably might be speccing it a little bit bigger, but I just wanted to see or keep it under minimal costing where it's like T3 micro is I think free with your trial account. So you keep it to the T3 micro or the shape of which is or Linux machine shape, which is memory and CPU. Now in that node group, we are saying we create two nodes. It can grow up to two nodes and desire is two nodes. If you want auto scaling, you can increase later, and we're going to talk about this auto scaling maybe in future episodes. So then click on next. So the worker node will be 2 here. Now this is where I'm selecting the subnet or network for my this worker nodes. So again, looking at this diagram, so this is earlier we saw the network for here. Now what I'm defining here is this network. So my worker nodes will be created inside this network. So if you want to have your master node and worker node to be in a different network, which you should be, then you create a separate VPC here for this. Because this is a demo, I'm going to show you I'm using the same VPC both for worker node and master node. Ideally, you should keep them separately. So I'm using the default VPC and the subnet that comes with it. Now I'm saying allow remote access to the nodes. If I don't want remote access, I can disable that. But if you want to connect to this remote access, you need to create something called as SSH key pair. Now again, let me show you how you can create SSH key pair so that you can connect to these worker nodes through PuTTY. So right now there's no key pair. So I need to create a key pair, which is basically the SSH private public key through which I can connect to these machines. So I'll select console again and I'll say here, create a key pair. I'll give a name. So I'll say EKS worker node key pair and I'll say it in PPK format because I'm connecting from PuTTY. If you want to connect from a Unix or Linux machines or Mac machine, then you'll be using OpenSSH. So click on create key pair. And I'll save it with me because I'll need it if I want to connect to these machines. So save it on a place safely. And this is my fingerprint and ID. So that's all. Now I go back to this tab here, refresh it here. And here from drop down, you can see this key pair and then click on next. If I want, I can restrict and say from where I can connect to these machines. So right now I'll say connections all, but in production environment or your customer environment, you need to be restricting these access via a specific network security group, which is nothing but the firewalls. Click on next. And now I have my all worker node set up correctly, which says this is my node configuration, which is a node group. Right now, there's no labels, there's no tags. My network group, 5 GB disk. The instance shape is T3 micro. There are 2 worker nodes, and this is my subnet for these 2 worker nodes. So these worker nodes, 2 machines will be created in these 2 of these 3 subnets. I'm enabled SSH, and I can remotely connect to these machines and click on create. So this will now create my worker nodes. So refresh here. And the final part I'll be doing is I'll be validating with my configuration whether my nodes, these are like, it should be showing me 2 nodes, and dash dash watch means it will constantly see if there's any update or any command change or output changes, it will give me the output of that. So I'll go to this command prompt here and paste my commands, hit enter. So that means there's nothing changed. It's still building or creating my worker node, and soon I'll see these updates here on kubectl. So if you see here, status is saying creating. So it's creating a group 01. Inside that, it'll create 2 machines and with this version. So if you see, I've started getting that saying, it's looking, it's creating 2 machines, but it's saying not ready. And now it's saying ready. So one is dot 52 and second is 30. So the IP addresses are 172.31.20.52 and second is .14.30. These are 2 machines it's given me. So if I see here, still might be building it here or it's saying active. So that means my worker nodes, both the worker nodes are accessible now. So I can simply say, I can remove now nodes and say get nodes, kubectl get nodes. And this is now I have 2 nodes, both are ready. These are the 2 nodes ready. And right now they don't have any, they are not playing any role. That it started 64 seconds back and the version is v1.17.9 EKS on installed on that. Now that completes my Kubernetes cluster creation. So here in this diagram, I have this control plane, which is running here. And this worker node, I have 2 of these worker nodes. Instead of 3, I have 2 worker nodes and my control plane is managing this. Now in future episodes, I'm going to show you how to deploy applications and you can access these applications. Whatever command you can run on your Kubernetes cluster like kubectl, get pods information or get nodes information, all those commands you can run it from here as well. Now, final thing before I go is idly stop or delete this cluster, because otherwise, if you leave this cluster running, it will be charged, it will be deducting money from your account. So before you delete, you first need to delete the worker node. So I'm going to select here group and then say delete. And I need to type the group name here, click on delete, and then it will take around 5 minutes or so. Once this is deleted from here, you go and delete the master node as well, and then delete any other component that you have created earlier, which is like roles if you want to delete. Otherwise, you can leave roles. You won't charge for roles, or networking if you've created any additional networking. So just to do a quick recap, what we did was we first set up the master node, then we installed the AWS CLI and kubectl CLI, and then we verified the status of my master node from kubectl. Then I installed worker node and we verified the worker node status from kubectl. And finally, we deleted this Kubernetes cluster or EKS cluster on AWS. So now it's your turn to go and create this Elastic Kubernetes service or Kubernetes on AWS using step-by-step procedure that you have just seen. Now, if you don't have an account yet on AWS, you can use one of the previous episodes by going to ketonacademy.com/AWS SA13 and scroll down, and in the middle there will be a video which I've done in one of the previous episodes, and or you also have a step-by-step instructions, so you can go and create an account on AWS, and then you log in and create a or search under services, type EKS, or start with creating this cluster. And if you're part of my certified Kubernetes administration training, which is CKA from Cloud Native Computing Foundation, then make sure you ask for this free bonus class, which is Kubernetes on AWS, where we go deep into these three topics. That is EKS, ECS, and Fargate. And if you're new to Kubernetes and not yet certified on Kubernetes for administrators or certified Kubernetes administrator CK from Cloud Native Computing Foundation, then I would like to invite you for a free approximately 90-minute masterclass where we're going to look at the Docker and Kubernetes for beginners. What is Docker? Architecture, basic concepts on both Docker and Kubernetes, including what all things you should learn for Kubernetes administration certification and 33 hands-on lab that you must perform. So get this free training by going to ketonacademy.com/Kubernetes02. And I'll see you next week with another episode on Docker and Kubernetes. Till then, take care.